Hey guys, welcome back and welcome to our second video in the fundamentals training series. In this particular workshop, I'm going to show you guys how we can model out our domains, specifically focusing in on the data and relationship aspects and how we can set up our entities in such a way that it meets the requirements of our system. All right, so let's jump right in. I'm going to be kicking this off from where we left things in the previous video. We've got our customer, we've got the fields. Next, what we can do is we can start to model out some additional entities with some relationships. All right, so let's jump right in. I'm going to start by right-clicking on the diagram. We're going to create a new entity, and we'll call this entity order. And that's because this is an eShop. We're going to be focusing on creating orders for customers. And these orders will most likely need order lines. So what orders, what were the different products that we wanted to that this particular customer had ordered through the system. So we can also set up another entity here called the order lines. And finally, we can set up one for the product, but you can see that I'd want to put this at the bottom. The If we want to shift and move and pan essentially this diagram to where we'd like it, I can use the middle mouse button or control click with the left click button, and we can just drag this to exactly where we want it to be. And I can go and I can create a new entity over here called product. All right, so those are the three terms that we spoke about. We said orders will most likely have order lines, which will have the product, and we can set the relationships up between these. So to set up relationships in the domain designer and intent architect, we can right click on the entity that we'd like to start the association from, and we can hover over a new association, and we can see the different types of associations that we can create. So the first one that we'll create here will be a one-to-many relationship between the order lines. And what we're essentially describing now is that our orders will have many order lines or can have many order lines, and that each order line will be associated back to a single order. And we can see the cardinality there with a star, meaning there are many order lines for the order, and that each order line will be associated back to a single order, and that's where the one is over there. And this is an important relationship, or the way that what this relationship describes has very important technical implications depending on our technologies and our architecture. So the architecture we're following at the moment has a relational database because of entity framework core that we're using, or at least that's the most likely case. And in a relational database, what this kind of a relationship will infer is that it is a ownership relationship and that there will be a cascade delete. And that is actually denoted over here for us with this black diamond. And this black diamond in the UML space, at least from a UML class diagram perspective, indicates that this is a compositional relationship. So it's a very strong relationship. What it really fundamentally means is that our orders own their order lines. If we were to delete the order lines should be deleted along with it. All right. Next, the next relationship we want to create is from the order lines to the product. So, of course, we want to specify for this order line, I want to order this specific product. So I can right click on my order line, go back to my associations, and we'll use a many to one relationship between our order lines and our products. And what this is really describing is that each order line will have a product, but that the product themselves could be associated with many order lines, right? That makes a lot of sense because I may have some kind of a shoe, and many orders can be linked to that shoe, and those orders may have an order line which will link accordingly. And so what we're really saying here is that order line must have a product, but that a product itself can have many order lines. All right, so then we can also fill in some of the details here. So if you remember from the first video, we can right click this and add attributes. I can add a order number attribute, and then I could use that control enter shortcut that I showed you guys in the previous video, and we can go create an order date. Now, because I want to change this to be not a string, I want it to be a date time, I can press tab. And what you can see on the right over here is this tab me over to select the type. And this is where we can just type in, for example, date, and just push down one and say enter, and we will have selected a date time. If we ever want to get back there, we can right click and say rename, and then say tab over to the type, so date time. Another alternative is to push F2, and I can do the same from this angle. And then the final way that we can do this, just for completeness sake, is we can change that directly here in the properties. I can also hit the drop down, and I can search for the type that I'd like to look for in my properties over here. Next, on the order line, we can do the same thing. I can add an attribute. We can call it units. So how many units did this customer order of this particular type of product. Control enter, we want to know the price of this unit, so price per unit, so we'll call it unit price, which I'll make tab a decimal, right? And then we can also fill in the product, and we can say that the product will have a name and a description, which will both be a string for us over here. Now, one other attribute that we could add over here, and I'll just create a little bit of space for us to do so, is we could add on the order line, we could add a discount. So this could be something that could be applicable if our system supported discounts. So if we want to support discounts, we may want something like this, and we can make that a decimal, but let's, for argument's sake, say that this discount is optional. It's not something that has to be required. Maybe if there are specific promo codes that we're going to bring in to apply these discounts, that's where this will become applicable. If we want to make this an optional field, we can just say that it is nullable by ticking this checkbox over here. And another way to do this would be to right click and say toggle is nullable, and that'll toggle back and forth between the two nullable options. And what you'll notice is for most of the options in these context menus, there are shortcuts which we can apply. All right, so that's the first set of relationships. Now, our orders themselves must be linked to a customer. So I'm sure you're probably guessing that this would be a many to one relationship back to the customer. But a very common question we get when we run through the modeling with different developers is, could it not be possible that, and I'll just show you the alternative, that if I invert this relationship, so I just right clicked on the association, hover over change association and say invert, that this should be a one-to-many relationship and that my customer is actually owning its orders. And so this would mean that there's a compositional relationship between our customers and our orders. And this would imply, number one, that if I deleted my customer, all of its orders would be deleted. But the other implications here is that typically we would only access our orders via the customer. So if we wanted to change an order, for example, in our system, we would pull out the customer, rather, and we would add our order or change one of the orders in the list of that customer. In a system where we are focusing on orders and there could be quite literally thousands of orders against a customer, that could have some dramatic performance implications. And so it's very unlikely that we would want to model it this way around. But what I'm really pointing to here is that this is not a hard and fast rule. The relationship dynamics between entities is very subjective to the system. There's no one particular relationship is correct and another is wrong. Depending on how your system is going to operate and the way that you want to interact with your system, you will most likely model your domain accordingly. And within that modeling, you will capture a huge amount of the intention, and it's very, very information dense when it comes to how we model out these relationships. So in a system, just going to right click on this association over here, I'll invert this back. In a system like ours, most likely we would want to set it up so that the order is its own aggregate root, which has a compositional set of order lines, and that's many of them, and that this is pointing to, if you want to think about it like that, it's pointing to the customer. So who is this customer for? But we're also indicating that this customer is required. So the order must be created with the customer. All right, another relationship that we can create here, or another entity to start with, is the concept of an address. Okay. And our address will have I'm just going to use the shortcut here. If you guys didn't notice it from earlier, is the Control-Shift-A shortcut. So on the address, Control-Shift-A is going to create us our attributes, and we can call this line 1. I could say Control-Enter, and we can create line 2. And if you recall from earlier, the shortcut to make things nullable is Alt-N. And I'll make this nullable, or I can, of course, just tick this tick box over here because your line 2 may not be required. And then we can say Control-Enter, and we could add our city, and Control-Enter, and finally add our postal code. Now, the relationship between the customer is that between our customer and our address is that our customer itself may have a one-to-one relationship with the address, but this could be specifically the delivery address. So if I select my association and I say F2, you can see that I'm going to head back over to renaming it, and we can call this our delivery address. And because it's a one-to-one, it means that if we were to delete the customer, we would also be deleting the addresses. Now, that's of course something that, depending on the type of system that we're operating, may not be true. You may not want to delete the addresses. This may be something that is shared between lots of customers. As I mentioned earlier, this is actually quite subjective to the system that you're building, the way that you want to interact with your system, and the technical implications of that. So, a lot of the stuff is going to be driven by those technical implications, like, for example, whether we're going to be creating these addresses completely independent of our customer, unlikely in this kind of a system. So this is most likely the relationship that we will follow here. All right, the next relationship we can create is a similar one, but it's a 1-to-0-1 relationship. And that's going to be for our, to the F2 here, for our billing address. So if you guys are familiar with Amazon and these other eShop systems, they're very strict about making sure that you can give them the address to deliver it, but they offer you the ability to say, is the billing address any different from the delivery address? And if so, you can tick a box typically and you can go fill it in. So this would be to cater for those kinds of needs if our system was going to provide that functionality. And then the final thing that we could probably want to have in our system, just to give you guys a bit of a broader view here as part of this introduction to domain modeling, is we would probably want to have a status of the order. Is it shipped? Is it delivered? Is it paid? Is it canceled? Whatever the case is. So we can just right click on the diagram and create an enum. And we can call this enum our order status. And I can right click on the order status, and you'll see it also has the Control Shift A, which is really just add the the most basic or most likely type that you want to add. You'll see the Control Shift A comes up a lot. We can add a literal here. We'll call it placed. So this is our order placed, which I can just tab and say 1, and that'll basically set this over to be, the value will be 1. Okay. So for it, you could set it to a value of 0. In personal experience, by setting your enums to start at 1, to have even values of -1, but never a value of 0, since most enums are persisted as an integer or at least serialized as integers, um, this avoids a lot of bugs. It actually throws exceptions. If you have a value of 0, very often a bug can go undetected. And so just a simple tip here is never use a 0 as an enum value. It's not a hard and fast rule, but if you avoid it, sometimes, and in a lot of cases, it can avoid some bugs too. Let's go flesh this out. So we've got our placed, we've maybe got our um, shipped status, which I'll make it 2. Maybe we have something like a delivered, which will make a 3, and perhaps a canceled, which we can make a 4, or a -1 or whatever the case is. And now, in order for us to add this enum onto our order, we just simply add another attribute, which we'll call status. And I'll tab over and look for my order status enum. And here we can see that it is selected over there. One other useful tip here when it comes to the diagrams is if I hold down Control, and you can see if I hover over, for example, the order status and I click on it, it's going to take me to it in the diagram and also highlight it here in the tree view for us. All right, guys. So this is just dragging us back in. This is our first and most basic domain. I do want to add one more entity with a relationship just to give you the final very typical type of relationship that we would model over here. So let's just right click on the diagram and we can add ourselves the concept of, let's just say, a product category. And we can add Control Shift A, a name onto this. And then I can set the relationship here to be a many to many. Now, this is an important relationship too. And by the way, you can see I could just rename this to categories so that it's a bit shorter. We don't have the product to have product categories. We could just have categories, as I'm sure you guys would expect. But a many-to-many relationship, at least in a relational database paradigm, would end up with a joining table that'll be created by Entity Framework, right? So just keep that in mind. The technical implications of our designing here are very, very real. And we will design according to our technologies and our architecture. If we were building for a document store, the way that we would design and model out our domains would be oftentimes quite different from the way that we would do it for a relational database. And we would always keep in mind the technical implications of this and how that can affect the performance of the system, and the throughput and the readability of things and so on and so forth. All right, so that's just a quick introduction to the modeling. If we say save and run our software factory execution, we can see all of this code being generated for us, and we can go ahead and apply all of it. And if you open up your solution, you can do that by clicking on this link, if you recall from the previous video, and double clicking on the SLN. I've actually got it open for myself over here. We can go through all of this code. You can see your entities. We can see there's our order. We can see there's the order status, the order lines themselves, the customer. So we can see all of our relationships. We can go through, probably the more interesting side of things is to go through the entity framework aspects. So here on the customer configuration, we can see that the different ways that entity framework would configure up the relationships between our delivery address and our billing address. You can see that this one is required and that this one is not. Similarly, for the order configuration, we can see that this is by default going to be owning the order lines, but has a relationship with the customer. And this is basically another way of telling Entity Framework that this is not going to apply a cascade delete, and that if I were to delete my order, it should not go ahead and delete our customer. Similarly, for the product, there's that one-to-many relationship. All right, guys. So this is just a very quick introduction to some of the basics of domain modeling. There's, of course, a lot more that we'll cover in the later workshops. And looking forward to catching you guys in the next one, where we're going to go through how we can set up services to act on this domain in a much more comprehensive way. Looking forward to seeing you guys there. Until then, cheers.